Hello, I'm Hobbs, and it's my pleasure to be here today with Jodie Bernstein. Jodie, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Kaz, it's my pleasure to be a part of this very interesting project. Thanks for including me.
It's my pleasure to be doing this. I should acknowledge to you and to everyone that I am hardly an unbiased observer and interviewer on this. You and I have been friends since 1969 when we both started at the FTC. And throughout your remarkably diverse and successful career, I have been enormously impressed with your effectiveness as a lawyer and the pragmatic, the fine-tuned sense of pragmatism that you bring to finding solutions to problems, both in the public sector and the private sector. So I confess to that bias. I'd like to start by getting your CV on the record, if I could. You graduated from Yale Law School at the top of your class, were a member of the Yale Law Review. In the public sector, you served most recently for 6 years as director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. Prior to that, you served as general counsel and assistant administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. You've also served as general counsel of HHS. Do I have that right? Or
that's correct.
And then you served as chair of the Commission on Wartime, Relocation, and Internment of Civilians, which I want to get to later on. And in 2003, you were awarded the Federal Trade Commission's award for Lifetime Achievement, the Miles W. Kirkpatrick Award. Right so far?
Absolutely. Terrifically right.
All right. In the private sector, you're currently with the Bryan Cave law firm in their Washington office. You had incarnations in various other law firms prior to that. You were general counsel in Chicago of Chemical Waste Management Company, and then subsequently senior vice president of Waste Management Company.
Correct.
Did I leave anything out?
I don't think so.
All right. I should also add that if you do a Google search on Jodie Bernstein, you get 566,000 hits. So further research is going to be difficult. In short, it's a remarkable career that continues as we speak. So Jodie, with that background, help us understand where did the spark come from that took you from Galesburg, Illinois to Yale Law School and then through this remarkable career? Was it your family, your larger family, the Jewish community in Galesburg, something in the water? How do you explain all of this?
I guess some of all of the things you mentioned, Cass, but principally, I think, because of my family. My father was very supportive of both my education and my brother's education, which was unusual at the time. My father, I think, was a very practical man, but very bright, though uneducated in the formal sense. And he told both of us from the very beginning that he would help us with our education as long as he was able to and as far as we wanted to go. So very early on, I felt as if, because I was a good student and I was, quote, ambitious. I was ambitious for myself. I was ambitious for my family in a way. We were an immigrant family. I was not an immigrant. My father was an immigrant. And those families often saw the United States, the Golden Land, as it was called, opportunity. And for that reason, though they might not achieve a great deal while in their lifetimes, they wanted it for their children, and I was one of them. I was a beneficiary of that. I also had what would now be called a role model. My father's youngest sister had become a physician in the early 1930s. My father and his brother supported her education, and she and I were very close. We were closer in age, because she was so much younger than my father. And I always felt I had her support, her encouragement, and because of her achievements in a very unusual for a woman to be the first board-certified pediatrician in the United States, it didn't seem like such a big deal for me to go to law school.
Well, now, where did the law school idea come from? Was that your idea, your father's?
That was really my idea. Yeah. And early on, I developed an interest in politics, in Illinois politics, and county politics with my friends at school, and my father's interest in politics. He was a Democrat in a largely Republican county, and that was just interesting to me. I followed it in the little newspaper, and I liked talking about it with him and with my friends who became interested also, mostly the male friends, not my female friends, and decided that, and why I thought this was possible, I don't know, that I could have a political career. I don't know why I thought that was possible, because there certainly was nobody that I knew of. I think one woman had been a member of Congress at that stage of my life. So I don't know where that came from, except, as I said, my family's seemingly mythology of open opportunity. Open opportunity. And so I decided, well, most politicians seem to have law degrees. And then I thought, if I don't make it there, I guess I could always hang my shingle out and make a living. Yeah. The other part of it was that I really never felt that it was a guarantee that you were going to find someone, marry, and have somebody take care of you. That was Jodie, my father always said, too, be able to take care of yourself.
In your case, that was a lock, but we'll go on from there. Did you ever consider a medical career?
No, I wasn't good at science. That was that I thought was not my long suit.
All right. How about your undergraduate degree? What was that in, and where did you get it?
My undergraduate degree was from the University of Wisconsin, and my major was, believe it or not, in economics, and I had a minor in political science.
Well prepared for law school and politics.
Yes.
Yeah. And how did you choose Yale Law School?
That was kind of an interesting selection on my part. I took constitutional law in the poli-sci department, and I did very well in it. I liked it a lot, and I thought, is this what you do in law school? This is pretty good stuff. So when I was at a stage of applying for law school, I went to talk to my professor, David Feldman, who was a PhD in political science, and asked him about law school and whether he would write a recommendation for me. I had thought, well, Illinois, I suppose, or maybe Northwestern. I had never been to the East Coast at that point. As far as I had been with Chicago, Madison, etc. And he said to me, just out of the box, look, it's very hard for a woman to be a lawyer. Why don't you get a PhD in political science? You're good at that. And I said, my father will support me in law school because he thinks you can make a living. If I have a PhD, he will say to me, is that a little like being a pharmacist? And the answer was that I just didn't think that would work for me. He then said, well, then you must go to the Yale Law School. The other schools are all trade schools. And Yale Law School is different. I think you will find it a congenial atmosphere. He had gotten his PhD at Yale. And I said, okay, and sent off my application to the Yale Law School.
Did you have an inkling of the kinds of glass ceilings that you might start encountering as you got into the legal profession at that time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I mean, there were still many, many law firms who said flat out, we don't hire women. There were those kinds of positions throughout the country, in every part of the society. Yes, I was aware of that, but as I said, I thought, worst comes to worst, I can hang up my shingle somewhere.
All right, so you finished at Yale on top of your class, Yale Law Journal. Today, every door in every law firm in the country would be open to you. When you left and you started looking for a job, were they open?
Well, interestingly enough, many, many law firms were not open to women. And I went down to New York to look for a job at Christmas time, which was when we went to be interviewed for jobs in New York. And New York at that time, in my narrow-mindedness, was where the most opportunities might lie. I don't know why I didn't think about Washington, but I didn't think about Washington. In retrospect, I think I probably would have had a very different career had I done that. But I was interviewed in New York by, in over a couple of days, eight or so law firms, because the law school helped us be interviewed, and most of them let me know right away that they'd be happy to say hello and that there was no prospect that I'd be hired. However, when I returned to the law school, I had offers from 2 law firms, one of which I accepted, which was Sherman and Sterling. And everybody was so shocked. I was shocked, stunned. The dean said to me, "Are you sure? Where's the letter? You got an offer from Sherman and Sterling?" I said, "Yes." And the rest was history. I had a very, very more than pleasant, very, very positive experience at Sherman and Sterling.
Well, what kind of practice did you have?
I had a general corporate practice. The way the firm was set up, there were 6 new associates from law firms. 5 of them were men and me. And there was a rotation. One partner was the assignment partner, and the other partners had to come to him, and whatever they needed to have done, he would say, "Well, Joe's assigned to you for that," whatever. And I took general assignments. The hiring partner, who was also the assignment partner, would assign me to, in the same way he assigned the others. And one time, the chief of litigation, who was involved in a big litigation, said to who was Henry Harfield, was the assignment partner, a very, very distinguished banking lawyer. He said, "I'm not taking the girl. Get me somebody else. I'm the head of litigation. I can't have her going down to the court with us," and so forth. And Henry said, "Well, then you'll have to wait, because the others are all full right now. And you either have to take her or you'll just have to wait."
Now, did this go on in your presence, or did you hear about this later?
No, they told me about it.
Yeah.
They told me about it. No, it didn't go on in my presence. So I got assigned to this litigation chief, which I was not happy about, since I knew he was just waiting for me to fail. And fortunately, it was a very big assignment. I worked for him for about 3 or 4 months on this litigation. I did research. I did memo after memo. I did motions to this or that. Every step of the way, it was a torture, because I knew he was waiting for me to fail. And, of course, a couple of my associates would take to, at night when I get home at 11 o'clock, there'd be a phone call saying, "Joan, this is Bob." And I knew it would be one of my associates pretending to be the litigation partner. I did get through that with the help of some of the other people, not my colleagues, but some of the younger partners were very helpful to me. I got through that. By that time, then, my credentials were established. He hadn't fired me.
Well, good. I was going to ask, how did the 5 male associates that came in with you, were they supportive? Were they threatened? What was their...
Interestingly enough, they treated me in much the same way that my colleagues in law school had, which was very warm, very open. We were colleagues. We worked together. We talked together. I was accustomed to that because I'd gone to a co-ed school. So I had lots of male friends and colleagues that I had served on, various activities on. I was very accustomed to it. Some of my colleagues who had gone to women's schools found it less easy to develop those kinds of relationships than I did. I felt very comfortable, and for whatever reason, and part of it may have been that many of our classmates, most, were returning war veterans. And they were a little older, a little more mature. Many were married, which was unusual at the time. And therefore, they were pretty confident people. They were not threatened. There were a few, maybe, who made nasty remarks and things, but not many. And my colleagues at Sherman Sterling were the same.
It's always been my impression in any event that you never shattered glass ceilings. You melted them away. So,
well, that may have been the trick.
Yeah. After your practice with Sherman and Sterling, you went back to Chicago. What took you back there?
I was getting married to my now and then husband, Lionel Bernstein, and he said to me, which turned out not to be true, "You've got to come to Chicago. I was so happy at Sherman Sterling that I wanted him to come to New York. He was already a doctor and he had a PhD and so forth. And he said, no, my career is going to be much more important than yours. These were the 50s. So I said, oh, that's right. And so I went back to Chicago. We were married that year and then embarked upon trying to be a young housewife in the 50s and a lawyer at the same time in the city of Chicago.
Well, now, how were the Chicago law firms? Were they receptive?
No. The Chicago law firms, and I did have one particular episode. One of the partners, important partners in New York, had actually called people in Chicago for me to say, you should talk to this young lady. She's coming to Chicago, and we had a wonderful experience with her. You should consider her. I went to see one of them, and he was holding the letter from New York in his hand, and he said, I don't know what they're thinking of in New York. Yes. We don't hire women here. Why would we hire women? It was not a happy kind of process that I went through, but I did get a job in a law firm, and unlike Sherman Sterling, it just didn't seem to be able to adapt to a woman among the associates. And the associates were uncomfortable with it as well, except for one, because of the culture of the firm, which was the men and women simply were not allowed to mix. You couldn't go to lunch with the other lawyers because you couldn't go to lunch with the women's secretaries, so you couldn't go to lunch with the lawyer either. It was a very, very uncomfortable kind of atmosphere, environment, if you will. And I, like a lot of women, I think, to some extent blame myself because I couldn't make it work. And in some ways, the burden is always on us, or at least on women that have told me stories similar to this, that to some extent I thought it was my fault. And we eventually decided that I would just simply leave. And I was pregnant anyway by that time, and they couldn't have tolerated a pregnant woman walking around. There was one funny aspect of it. I was pregnant, and when I finally had to admit to them that I was pregnant, they said, well, because I had kept my maiden name, and they said, well, now listen, you can't be Miss anybody. You've got to be Mrs. somebody. Give somebody's name. So that's how I changed my name to Bernstein.
And left the law firm.
And left the law firm.
Well, good for you. So we have 15 years in Chicago, 3 children, and then you came to Washington for the first time. Yes. And that was Dr. B's doing?
Yes, that was Dr. B's doing. He came to be head of research at the Central Office of the Veterans Administration, and we moved here with our 3 children, and which allowed me to hook up again with my roommate from law school, Patricia McGowan Wald. We had been roommates for 3 years. We were great friends and had remained friends. She had, by this time, 5 children, had not gone back to work yet, and she said to me, you got to live at most 5 blocks away from me. I said, okay, and we did.
During those 15 years in Chicago, raising children, was it always in your mind that you would go back to the practice of law?
Yes. It was always in my mind that as soon as we got the kids to some stage, and by the way, the prevailing ethic was that if you were married and your husband supported you and you had children, you were supposed to stay home with those children. Yes. It was only if your husband disappeared or whatever that you were allowed to, think about going back to work with children for the most part. So, yes, I always contemplated that at some point when the children got a little older and I got resettled or whatever, that I would try to go back to work.
Now, did Dr. Bernstein think you ought to be home with the children, or would he have been okay if you practiced law in Chicago?
Oh, I think he'd have been okay with it. But there really weren't any opportunities either. I did go one day when I was kind of fed up with everything because I'd seen an ad in one of the legal pubs that a bank not too far away was looking for a part-time person on trusts and estates, and I thought, oh, that can't be hard, and surely there's no night work on those kind of things. And I did, and they interviewed me, and they said, basically, you belong home with your children. So I said, okay. That was the only time I really tried.
Yeah. So you came to Washington. Was the legal market in Washington more receptive than Chicago?
It turned out to be. It certainly turned out to be for me. Yeah. By that time, of course, it was 1967 when we came back. And things were beginning to change in the United States generally. Feminism was already an emerging trend. And so there were some changes that were going on in the general society.
You practiced in private practice for a few years in Washington and then decided to go to the FTC.
Correct.
What led you to that decision?
The practice I was in was with a classmate of mine who was also a dear friend. He practiced alone, and he probably should always have practiced alone. Brilliant, brilliant man. And I worked directly for him, and it was something like an apprenticeship, really. I've always valued it because he made me do things that I didn't know how to do. Draft a complaint, go out there, file that case, and things of that sort. I got to be a lawyer again. I knew how to do it. He taught me a lot because he'd been practicing for all those years and was a very, very good lawyer. However, our practice got bigger and bigger, and we had mostly assigned to me, and some of which I began to bring in, the divorce cases. I was quite popular with women whose husbands were leaving them. This was that time of domestic ferment. And I really disliked it intensely because it isn't legal work. It's social work.
Sure, sure.
And it was very demanding. It was demanding at home. People would call me at home. It was becoming very tense at home, this kind of practice, which I had to do by myself. There was nobody to share it with because he was doing other things, and I was basically having to do this by myself. It was a fairly tense time for the family because I absolutely had to figure out something else to do. And so I looked around, talked to Pat and Bob, her husband, who was also a classmate, and through them and a couple of other conversations decided I should go into the government. My husband knew a lot about government practice at this point and work, and thought, well, it should be a little bit easier to manage, perhaps. There will at least be other people who, if your kid is sick, you can say, can you do this for me today? And so I focused on new opportunities in government. I rejected the SEC because I thought everybody must be a fully established practitioner there. Mm-hmm. There isn't going to be much opportunity there for new people coming in. And I called Bob Wald, who, as I said, was a classmate and an FTC practitioner, and said, what do you know about the FTC? Because I had read some things in the paper. He said, you want to go there to work? And I said, yes, I do. Because by that time I had done a little research, and I knew about the report, and I knew about some of the, Ralph Nader and all that. I thought, that's a place that's changing. They'll be bringing in new people. That'll be a place of opportunity, I think, for a new person.
So at that juncture, though, the FTC was still essentially a male white WASP bastion.
Oh, yes.
And you were one of the first. I mean, here you are, a Jewish mother of three. Who did you talk to, and how did that hiring process go?
Well, first of all, Bob Wald simply picked up the phone and called the executive director, Basil Mazinas, who became, of course, a very dear friend in the end, and told him about me and my credentials, and that I wanted to come back to work. And Basil said, well, the new bureau director, Bob Potofsky, is insisting on interviewing everybody, even entry level, because I only asked for entry level. I wasn't asking for, a big position. And he said, I tell you what, Bob, I'll send her papers up to Petoskey. Petoskey was still in New York. He hadn't come down yet. And he sent up my papers up there. Basil didn't even talk to me. He just sent the papers up because Bob was supposed to interview every GS-12 and 13. There was a lot of hiring going on at the time, as you know.
You came in as a GS-12?
GS-12.
All right.
What were you, an 11?
I came in as a GS-7.
Oh, well, by that time.
Yeah, well.
And Bob says that he reviewed my papers and Bob Wald's recommendation and said to Basil, I don't think I need to interview her. I think you can just go on and make her an offer. So it was like a week that I got this offer from the commission, and there it was, October of 1970, that I said, I'm going downtown to work. I hardly even knew how to get there.
And did you have any antitrust or consumer protection experience?
I had a little bit of antitrust way back in Sherman and Sterling, because, of course, they had a big antitrust practice. I wouldn't say that I was very knowledgeable, but I knew about the Sherman Act, and I knew a little bit about that area of law. I didn't know anything about consumer protection at all.
But now that's where they put you, is consumer protection?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Tell us about your first encounter with the FTC chairman.
All right. On October, whatever it is, let's say the 5th of October, I was told to show up downstairs where they, I think, fingerprinted you and took your sworn oath that you'd defend the United States and all that. I think we still had to do oaths then. And another gentleman, a very, very distinguished gentleman with very nice-looking suit and clothes on, was there with me, and he was ahead of me. He was being processed, and I was going to be processed, just the two of us. And he introduced himself, and I introduced myself, and he said to me, where are you working? And I said, I'm being assigned to the advertising section of the Bureau of Consumer Protection. Where are you? And he said, upstairs on the 4th floor. I said, well, good. I hope we run into each other again. I had no idea that he was the incoming chairman, Miles W. Kirkpatrick.
Tell us about Miles. Give us your recollections of Miles.
Miles, I have always called my one and only chairman, because he was so perfect in every way. First, he was a superb lawyer, and I valued that skill very, very much. He was also had management skills that we probably wouldn't have called management skills then. He was very personable. He was very charming. He was very informal in style. But he knew a great deal about the organization. I think he had a good sense of how one goes about achieving consensus among commissioners, and how he could find out really what was happening in that agency that would not come as either a scandal, a surprise, or some embarrassing kind of episode that he would have to defend as chairman. I think I've said this to you before, but one of his skills was that he was one of the best listeners that I've ever encountered. He listened and he processed, and no matter whether you were GS-12 or you were the head of the Bureau. It was in that way that I came to have the highest regard and respect for him. He was also just a charming, wonderful, cultured person that was a pleasure to be a part of his organization.
He was unique, wasn't he?
He was indeed unique, and surrounded himself with wonderful people like you and Michelle Koresh and Nancy Buck.
Tell us about your early years at the FTC. You were in the advertising division. What kind of cases did you have? What was it like working for Bob Petoskey in those days?
Well, I was assigned to what was then called the Division of Food and Drug Advertising. And I first encountered, well, Jerry Thane was the head of it, and he was very, very knowledgeable about consumer protection law, which was great because I certainly wasn't. And I was quick to learn because there were people around. I knew a lot more about, I think, practicing law than they did, but they knew a whole lot more about the commission and how the commission did its work. But I had people there that I could work with and learn from. And one of them, of course, was my lifetime colleague and friend, Nancy Elbuck, who was just, she'd been out of law school only a year, but she'd been there, and of course she was another woman, and we very quickly became friends and colleagues. We did, for example, the investigation into the toy industry, which had become landmark cases, Topper and Mattel. We investigated, we brought complaints, and we had the first, I think, headed by Bob Potofsky, press release announcing those complaints, which were, as then and now, landmark cases in setting some standards about children's advertising and what the requirements were. Then, after that, Bob assigned us to be staff to the commission and to him in developing the agenda for the modern advertising hearings that the commission itself had asked for. Nancy and I spent most of several months off and on in New York interviewing the heads of ad agencies and media people to get ready to have an agenda for the commission to hold these hearings. It was a remarkable experience. I hardly knew what I was doing. I don't know how we did it, but somehow we pulled it off, and it was very, very successful. The reports that were ultimately published about those hearings really set agenda for how to pursue the violations in advertising for the next several years.
And I think that report also let the people in New York know that the FTC was a new agency that was very serious about getting into national advertising in the way it hadn't before. So,
oh, absolutely. In fact, when we first arrived in New York with with appointments to meet the heads of a couple of ad agencies, I remember one of the headlines, and I think Women's Wear Daily or one of them said something like, "Bernstein and Buck attack Madison Avenue." I always loved that. They had no clue of what this agency was. It had been totally unregulated for years, at least by the federal government, and not by anybody else either. So it was also a wonderful opportunity because nobody else knew anything about it either. And therefore, if you became somewhat expert, that I think we did, Nancy and I, and to the same extent Bob did also, it was it was one of Bob's first and my first understanding of Bob's initiative to use that Section 6 authority at the FTC to hold hearings, to really issue reports to Congress and to the public, which had not been used in that same way. Bob, both when he was bureau director and when he was chairman, stressed the importance of the use of that particular function.
And my impression was that those hearings gave you, Bob's staff, and the commission the credibility and the expertise that was really needed to prosecute those cases successfully in the future. And the companies that you dealt with from there on out more often than not settled rather than litigate cases.
Absolutely. In fact, when the advertising industry, through the 4As, finally got it into their heads that this was real and that it was something they needed to pay attention to, they actually asked for 2 days, I believe, in order to make their own presentation. And we, of course, welcomed them to do that, and they did it, and they did a superb job. Yeah, yeah. But that took them a while, too. First they said, no.
So what's your favorite recollection of Bob Potofsky from that era?
My favorite recollection is that Bob was a remarkable and skillful, not only lawyer, because he's a very good lawyer, but he taught me something that has been very useful to me, that if you really do want people to do their best with you. You need to delegate to them, but you have to be responsible then for what they do. He delegated a great deal to me and a couple other people he had a very small staff. That was typical of Bob. Bob never had he didn't like big bureaucratic organizations. And he handed me large responsibilities, which if I made a mistake, and I do recall a mistake or two that I made, but one particular one in which I said, I did this, Bob, and we didn't tell the commission.
You what?
He said, what was it? Did you tell me before? I said, I don't think so. And he said, well, what can they do? They can't fire both of us. It turned out all right. He was an excellent mentor in every sense for me. And the other thing about Bob Petoskey was, even back then, when many men were not comfortable with women as almost as equals in terms of their roles with him, he did not have a discriminatory bone in his body. If you did the work, fine. That was all that mattered.
All right. Well, let's skip over your time as general counsel in 2 different federal agencies and go to that period when you came back to the FTC as director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection. How did that come about, and tell us about that experience?
Well, first, how did it come about? Bob and his lovely wife, Sally, and my husband, had been social friends after we had worked together for many years. And so I saw them, of course, and kept in touch with Bob on a semi-professional basis, even when I was at EPA and things of that sort. But by this time, I was in Chicago at a corporation, and I had a very good job. I was at the point, however, I'd been there 10 years, and I was at the point where I thought, gee, I can retire from here, because 10 years was kind of a turning point in service. And I was thinking, because my husband and I had both decided we wanted to come back to Washington when I retired from there. So I was kind of thinking about it. I was perfectly happy there. We had a good life, and I had an interesting job, and we had nice friends and so forth, but we had made that decision when one day, I believe in January of 1996.
Okay.
No, I'm getting my dates mixed up, Gaz. I came back in 95, so it was the beginning of 95 that he called me. And I was in Chicago, and he said to me, listen, I'm going back to the commission. I'm going to be chairman. I said, yes, I know. That's terrific. And he said, I've got people for a competition, and I've got a general counsel. I don't have anybody yet for a BCP. And you always keep up with all these people and stuff. I thought maybe you'd have some recommendations for me to consider. And I said, oh, sure, I'd be happy to do that, Bob. At which point he said, unless, of course, you'd like to do it. And I said, well, I would. Just like that. I said, well, I would. Oh, well, he said, done. Done. And that's how that happened. Literally, that's how it happened. I went home that night and said to my husband, well, if Bob gets confirmed, which he hadn't been yet, we're going back to Washington. I'm going back to run the Bureau of Consumer Protection. My husband said, fine, great. That's terrific, because we had planned to go anyway. So that's how that came about. It was several months. Well, let's see. That was January. He was confirmed in April at right when the antitrust section was meeting. And he called me and said, I'm confirmed, and I'm going to announce that you're coming back. I said, fine. So then I began an effort on my part to begin to catch up with what had been going on in more detail. I really hadn't followed the commission that closely because I was so much involved with environmental issues and with security issues and state issues in my role at the company and I didn't have much reason to be following the FTC. We had antitrust lawyers, of course, but I didn't have to do that.
Sure. And now the Internet had become a big part of the world and the Commission's practice at that point.
No.
No?
It had not. 1995 was the very beginning, really, of commercial traffic on the Internet. The Internet was, as you know, developed as an academic tool, and it was just at the first stages of being used for commercial advertising and marketing. So, and I remember vividly going down and visiting the Chicago regional office before I got to Washington. I was already the bureau director, but I went down there to see what had happened there. And the director said to me, Joe, do you know about the Internet? I said, well, yes, I know a little about it. He said, well, we have 4, he said, I'd like to describe this to you. There are 4 little operators, and they're all violating FTC law, but they're little tiny operations, maybe 2 guys with a little, and you know, the FTC for many years doesn't go after individual little operators. You know, you get the biggest bang for the buck and all that. And I said, well, let me look at them. And he showed me these 4 or 5 little cases. I said, well, you know what, Steve? Let's bundle them up and decide what we're going to do with them. And we will then be able to make a statement, because it was clear they were all violating. One was a college kid who was running something out of his dormitory. And we'll issue a press release that will establish our authority over one more avenue of commerce, which is this Internet. I always thought that it was quite a smart move on our part, because it allowed us to be the primary monitor of commercial development of the Internet, as opposed to another agency that took 4 years to determine whether or not they had authority over the Internet. We were out there. I think we played a very valuable role. It was very valuable to the Commission in terms of positioning it as a modern organization, a modern agency that could adapt to very new commercial issues.
And so by the time you stepped out of the bureau director's job, how much of your practice at the Commission dealt with the Internet, do you think?
It was almost all Internet related. The privacy issues were almost all generated, not exclusively, because the other technologies, the phones and so forth, had begun to generate the same issues. But almost all of the fraud cases were Internet related. That was the new mechanism for reaching consumers.
Let's stay on fraud for a minute. I've always wondered whether the Commission thought that it should have greater powers in the fraud area. But this is criminal behavior, essentially. Should the Commission get criminal sanctions to deal with fraud?
I'm beginning to think so. And the reason I do was I thought we made considerable impact in enforcement of big fraud cases and getting money from them, getting disgorgement from them, shutting them, a lot of them down. But it has become so much beyond even where it was when I was there that I now think that some judicious criminal enforcement would be very, very valuable, even in terms of trying to work with, like, the Canadian authorities and others, the offshore operators. It would be very valuable to have some criminal authority.
Let me shift gears for a minute. In your first tenure at the Bureau of Consumer Protection, rulemaking got started. A good number of rulemaking proceedings were prosecuted. Right. Most of them did not have happy endings, and then the Commission essentially walked away from rulemaking. Looking back on it, does rulemaking have a significant role in consumer protection? Or
I believe it does. I believe it does for the entire Commission. I know that there's very few people who agree with me about it, but I think there is rulemaking authority. I think it should be used judiciously. And to some extent, we did do some while I was back there. And in almost all circumstances, it was because Congress had become interested in a particular area. We worked very closely with our committees that governed our operations. And when I knew that they would be supportive and not negative, we would initiate rulemaking, which I thought was very, very useful. And in several statutes, the Congress gave us informal rulemaking authority, not Magnuson Moss, and we used that quite effectively. I think the Commission should still be using rulemaking authority. I don't believe it has, because I think there's been a bias toward case-by-case enforcement that I just disagree with. I think you have to use all of the tools the Commission has in order to be effective in this huge market that the Commission has to oversee.
Let's ask about another of the Commission's tools. In the consumer protection area, it has power over deceptive practices, and that's primarily how the Commission proceeds. But it also has power over unfair practices. Do you think that's a valuable tool in consumer protection cases?
I do. I do, very much so. I know there is some disagreement about that also among practitioners and others, but I think if used discreetly, that is carefully, that it can be very useful. And I'll tell you where. There are areas where there is no representation that one can use as a baseline for a deception case. There are hidden charges on phone bills, for example, that are on the 4th page. Well, you have to really manipulate deception in order to get to that. That's an unfair practice. So we did use it for that, and there are other instances like that. I think, as I always think, the Commission always has to act thoughtfully and carefully in exerting their authority. But that's one that I think they should always have, and I think the Bureau of Competition ought to use it. Now, there's a radical thought for you.
Mm-hmm. Jodie, if you had to pick one phase of your career and say, this is the best, which would it be?
Well, I'd be hard-pressed to pick between the first part at the FTC, the period of the 70s, which was such an extraordinary time, not only for me personally, because it was such a wonderful opportunity for growth for me, professional, personal, in every way. My family, everybody thrived, that I always considered a highlight. But when I went back, I really did feel as if I were better able, because of my experience, to do a better job as Bureau Director. The Bureau Director's jobs are wonderful jobs. I always considered myself very fortunate to have one, but I really felt that for the first time I was fully capable of doing the job in the way I thought it should be done. And partly that was experience that I'd gathered over the years. I was much better at it than I was in the 70s.
All right, let's take either one of those. And if a devil or an angel had come along and offered you the choice between that position and the governor of Illinois, which would you have picked?
Oh, dear, Caswell. I think that knowing who I am now, I would have to say the FTC. To be governor of Illinois, I would have had to have a very different trajectory in my career. And I suppose I would have had to be a precinct captain for, 10 years or so, which I never was. So I think possibly the highlight and one, if I had to pick, I'd pick the FTC.
One of the things that has always been said about the FTC is that it's very useful to have antitrust and consumer protection under the same roof, because the antitrust function can inform and help structure the consumer protection initiatives. Did you find your antitrust experience useful when you were at EPA and at HHS?
Yes, I did. I found it very useful. I have a most vivid recollection of it at EPA, particularly because EPA was such a pervasively regulatory agency in the way that the FTC isn't. And they really never considered in structuring a regulation over, let us say, certain parts of automobile parts that would be connected with emissions and things of that sort, whether or not they were basically violating the antitrust laws by rigidity in the way they went about doing it. I remember specifically that outside parties came in and said, you know, you should pay attention to the antitrust laws. And the memo that I was supposed to sign, that someone else in my office wrote, said, we're not subject to the antitrust laws. And I said, you know what, I'm not signing that. And neither is the administrator. I believe we're part of the administration, and one of the bedrocks of any administration are the antitrust laws. So I said, we're going to go back and look at that regulation and see if we can't adjust it so that it isn't creating what I think is, I don't know if it was technically a violation of the antitrust laws, but it was certainly anti-competitive.
Jodie, of all the things you've done, the one that really just blew me away was the time that you spent as chair of the Commission on Wartime Relocation. Tell us, how did that come about, and what was that experience like?
Well, it was at the end of the Carter administration when the commission that you described, which was to do a retrospective of the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, the law had been signed. The president was supposed to select 3 people. 3 people were selected by the Senate, and 3 people were selected by the House of Representatives. That's the way the law was set up. So I got a call from the White House, and I knew the White House people by that time very well, the personnel people, Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the domestic policy advisor to the president. I knew them because we did a lot, but both when I was at EPA and HHS, which was different than any experience I'd had. But I had come to know people there, and had done been on a couple of task forces with them, and so forth. So the phone rang one day. I was in private practice. I was at Wald Harkrader by that time, and it was the White House calling one of my friends in the personnel office, saying, look, there's like 5 minutes left, and we have these positions. Are you at all interested in being on this commission? So I said, well, send it to me, et cetera. Then I looked at it, and I'd had some civil rights experience at HHS because we had the department, what is now the Department of Education, was part of our, and we were responsible for various integrations of school systems where there was federal money. So I'd had a good bit of real practical experience in that area. And I said, yes. I knew very little. Obviously, I had read the Supreme Court cases when I was in law school because they were then final. But I certainly didn't know anyone in the Japanese American community at all. And I said, well, yeah. And so that's how that, after I asked Bob Wald if I could do that, because I would have to do it, you know, sort of basically out of the office. And he said, oh, absolutely. And you can have associates that they wanted to help you and so forth. So that's how that came about. Then the commission itself elected me chairman of the commission, and it was a remarkable experience. It was really remarkable. I was the only woman on it, and we had very, very distinguished members. One I remember the best, of course, was Mr. Justice Goldberg, Arthur Goldberg, who was the one who decided I should be chair, and he said to his colleagues, the other commissioners, you know, the girls usually get the work done. Let's have Jodie do that. And so that's how I got to be the chairman. We held hearings all over the country. We rewrote what I think was a remarkable report, I think based on my FTC knowledge of how important reports can be. And we issued our recommendations to the Congress, as we were directed to do, separately, so that we could set the historical record straight in the report. I knew by that time that that was what was really important to the community, and make our recommendations to Congress separately. We did that, and it took quite maybe 3 years, but the Congress adopted all of our recommendations, every single one of them, and they were all implemented. I wasn't involved in it anymore. The Justice Department did the redress part.
Jodie, we're just about out of time. As Miles used to say, is there anything else for the good of the order that we should cover?
I can't think of anything else. I hope it's been engaging for the people who may look at it as it has been for me, because it was a great pleasure. I've had a wonderful career, and the best part of it have been the people like you that I've had a chance to work with.
Thank you very much for being with us today. We've enjoyed it, Jodie. Thank you.